So welcome, my name is Reverend Dr. May Elise Cannon. Today is the 9th of October, 2025. This is a weekly update. We're now at day 300, oh my goodness, we're at day 734. And we're going to keep counting until there is a comprehensive permanent ceasefire, which we don't have yet. I think that's really important to understand, but day 734. 2 days ago marked the 2-year anniversary of the October 7th attacks. And I wanted to just talk about that for a minute before I jump into the ceasefire conversations. Mid-morning yesterday, the Washington Post published a piece called Enough. Israel marks 2 years since October 7th with sounds of war from Gaza. Israelis commemorated the second anniversary of the Hamas attacks on the south of Israel, and fighting continued. This was, of course, while the ceasefire negotiations were continuing. I've spent time in the kibbutzim, the kibbutz of Kfar Aza, on the Gaza border, where dozens of people were killed on October 7th, 2023. And this Washington Post article talked about how displaced residents of this farming community gathered together. They commemorated 2 years before the sun rose. That was on Tuesday. They reflected on what has since become of Israel to commemorate a terrible day in rituals marred by the irrepressible sounds of war. Sirens at one point warned of another attack. One of them, at least, was a false alarm. Another siren marked the anniversary of the day where roughly 1,200 people were killed during that cross-border assault. Throughout the morning, there were booms and thuds of artillery and airstrikes landing a few miles away in Gaza, its brutalized residents desperate for it all to stop. Now, what's significant in terms of understanding, before the agreement, there was an agreement that was come to yesterday. But what's important to understand is Israel had said that they were stopping the offensive in Gaza City. And what's been reported in U.S. news versus what's been happening on the ground is disparate. What's happening in the political realm and the discussions and what's being implemented are very contradictory. And so I want us to know, while death tolls have decreased a bit the past week, in general, what we're seeing on the ground has not been all that different from what we've seen in previous weeks. Churches Middle East Peace did put out a Prayers for Peace blog acknowledging 2 years of war, violence, and ethnic cleansing, grieving all loss of life from October 7th and in the subsequent or following 2 years. So that brings us to where we are today. Israel and Hamas overnight agreed on the initial terms of an exchange between Israeli hostages and roughly 250 Palestinian prisoners, many of whom have been incarcerated with life sentences, and 1,700 Gazans who've been detained by Israeli forces since October 7th. So 250 prisoners, 1,700 detainees in exchange for all of the living and dead hostages. Hamas confirmed the deal, but a Palestinian source told BBC they've yet to receive the list of Palestinian prisoners that Israel has agreed to. And Israel said that Netanyahu's office reported he was convening his cabinet today, that the agreement would be signed, which would then mark the start of a formal ceasefire. So essentially, Trump announced that this peace deal has happened, but I really want us to pay attention to the language. The peace deal to begin ending the war in Gaza. And one of the things we've been calling for is for the war in Gaza to be brought to an end. This is not the war in Gaza being brought to an end. This is the beginning of a multi-phase agreement. And as we know from past agreements, there's a lot that can go wrong when you have a phased approach to a comprehensive permanent ceasefire. I have updates from today that I didn't even put in my report that I am hesitant to look up because I think it'll be distracting. But Hamas just said, one of the things I was talking to our staff about this morning is this difference between the beginning of a process versus saying it's over. And the way it sounds in the news is like, oh, we've made it. We have a ceasefire agreement. You know, the end is here. And the devil is really in the details. And so I'll talk more about that. Late last night, Dropsite posted on their social media, if you're just catching up, that Israel and Hamas agreed to this first phase of a Gaza ceasefire deal. This is a phased deal. The hostages would be all released all at once, but it's really just a begin to ending the war. And our perspective, and we'll have a statement coming out momentarily from Churches for Middle East Peace, is that this is not good enough. And they would only sign an agreement if it guarantees that the war will no longer continue. And what Hamas came out with this morning is they said, wait a minute, Trump is talking about the beginning of the end, and we're saying this has to be the end. And so we may even see by the end of the day whether or not this actually moves forward, because there already is this public disconnect with what's being communicated from President Trump versus some of the other people at the negotiating table. The Israeli Prime Minister, an ICC fugitive, this is a direct quote, Netanyahu said he's convening his government today to approve the deal. Al Jazeera, meanwhile, reports that Israeli warplanes struck Gaza City right at the same time that the truce was announced. The casualties have not yet been confirmed. This is a 20-point plan for Gaza. It was announced by Donald Trump in late September of this year, and it's primarily broken down into 3 phases. And I thought I would go quickly and tell you what those phases are. Phase 1 is an immediate ceasefire and hostage release. This would be an immediate end to military operations, including an Israeli withdrawal to an agreed upon line. So what's been said in the news in the last 12 to 24 hours is that first geography has been agreed upon. Within 72 hours, all remaining Israeli hostages, alive and deceased, are to be returned by Hamas, and Israel would in return release those Palestinian prisoners I was speaking of, including those with life sentences and those who've been detained since October 7th. Phase 2 is what's called a sustainable calm. This is kind of a transition phase. And then there's broader arrangements in this phase, a sustainable calm. This is a plan for the demilitarization of Gaza, which the demilitarization of Hamas has been a major sticking point. What I'd read yesterday was that they'd agreed to a partial demilitarization. So this is part of what's being negotiated. This would include the decommissioning of Hamas's weapons under the supervision of international monitors. The Arab states have been pressing very strongly for this. Former Hamas members who commit to peaceful coexistence would be granted amnesty with safe passage for others who wish to leave Gaza. This is huge. Would Hamas leaders be allowed to leave or not and have amnesty in this agreement? They would. There would be large-scale reconstruction of Gaza that begins in phase 2, leading to phase 3, which is the major phase for reconstruction and future governance. There would be technocratic governance. A temporary transitional government of apolitical Palestinian technocrats would be established to oversee public services. There would be international oversight, a board of peace. This is what Donald Trump would chair. This is what Tony Blair would be a part of, the International Board of Peace. There would be an international stabilization force with the help of Arab and global partners. They would train and support vetted Palestinian police forces. This is what I've been talking about over past weeks that's already begun with Egypt. There would be the withdrawal of Israeli forces. The IDF would hand progressively territory over to the International Stabilization Force until a complete withdrawal is achieved. And then there would be a pathway to statehood. Now, you'll recall when this 20-point plan was announced from the White House Monday, not this last, but the week before, under Netanyahu and Trump. When this 20-point plan was announced, Netanyahu said he doesn't support 2 states. So even while there's an agreement being lauded, there is rhetoric, let alone implementation, that is contradicting it. So around 7:30 last night, Trump posted on his social media, he said, "I'm very proud to announce Israel and Hamas have signed off on the first phase of our peace plan." And then he went through some of the details. All parties will be treated fairly. This is a great day for the Arab and Muslim world, for Israel, all surrounding nations, the United States of America. We thank the mediators, Qatar, Egypt, and Turkey. And then he said, "Blessed are the peacemakers." So let's be very cautious. I mean, we can be hopeful and cautious in terms of seeking to understand what's happening. But, right as this was announced, as I was preparing this late last night, breaking news was that the Israeli army intensified its attacks across areas of Gaza City, blowing up residential homes, remotely detonating booby-trapped armored vehicles. So we went through the basic framework of the plan. Palestinian negotiators, after consultations with multiple factions, agreed to the deal. Again, it's the first stage. Hamas has long insisted it would not accept any deal without a full Israeli withdrawal. So what are the challenges? One of the challenges is Hamas will not be able to locate all of the 28 bodies of dead hostages. They've been upfront about this. They, at least in the last day or two, said that they did not know where 7 to 15 of the dead bodies were located. Israel has said they're aware that Hamas may not find all 28 and be able to return them, because that would be considered, or could be considered, a breach of the ceasefire agreement. Yesterday, U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner joined in the peace talks that were happening in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. Yesterday, senior Hamas leader Khalil al-Hayya told Egypt's News that Hamas was ready to reach a deal, but that they needed a guarantee that the war would be brought to an end and not be repeated. One of the big concerns is that the hostages will be released, the prisoners will be released as well, and then the war will just resume. Yesterday, senior Hamas leader, read that already. Hamas said today that they had exchanged the list of names of hostages and Palestinian prisoners. So Hamas has a list, Israel has a list. They, of course, have to agree. Yesterday, several Arab mediators said they hope Hamas can be persuaded to partially disarm. So even as of yesterday, that still was a question. Monday, Hamas had put forward their key demands, which again was the full halt to all Israeli military operations. And earlier in the week, President Donald Trump said if Hamas does not agree to this deal to give up power and control of Gaza, they will face complete obliteration. Now, let's just be precise. If Hamas is completely obliterated, that means obliteration for a large number of Palestinian civilians as well. Over the weekend, Hamas announced, this was last Friday, that it had agreed to this initial proposal. And that's when there were conversations about the negotiations beginning. They really didn't start until Monday or Tuesday in Sharm el-Sheikh. One of the concerns also that's important to acknowledge is that those who are negotiating for Hamas are a part of the political wing of Hamas, and the leadership of the military wing of Hamas is different. So over the past week, we've heard the political wing of Hamas say, yes, we support this. And then we've had different comments by the head of the military wing saying, no, we're not going to do that. And so who gets to make what call is one of the questions on the table. It is important to acknowledge that not only have global leaders in the Arab states and the European states and the Western nations supported this move towards this processed approach to a ceasefire, but South Africa and its government, the ones who brought forward the active case of the ICJ against Israel for genocide in Gaza, they have welcomed Hamas's response and urging Israel also to reciprocate in terms of its agreement and application. So we've already talked about the two major sticking points: the timeline and geographic location of Israel's withdrawal, the demilitarization of Hamas. Those have been the big questions. And again, what we've been hearing in terms of on the ground, President Trump will say the offensive has stopped, and then we hear displacement orders were issued to several schools near shelters of the Friends of the Patient Hospital on Friday in Gaza City. This coincided with another Israeli military attack at the Al-Noor Center in the Al-Ramal neighborhood, where families were forced to flee the area in the middle of the night carrying scant belongings. So you can watch videos on social media. I watched one this morning of children celebrating the news of this ceasefire agreement, and then others in Gaza are being displaced at the same time. On Friday, Israeli forces were, quote, tightening the siege around Gaza City. They considered any Palestinians who did not evacuate the city, quote, terrorists and supporters of terror. Israeli Defense Minister Katz said that hospitals in the city reported that 45 people in Gaza were killed on that day. So the IDF was supposed to switch to only defensive operations in the Gaza Strip in the middle of all of this. An Israeli military spokesperson in Arabic said that they issued a warning notice saying that the area north of the Gaza River is still an active and dangerous combat zone. I'll just remind you, in combat zones, anyone who is found traveling or relocating or out and about is considered a combatant. And often is killed. We also know that over the weekend, on one of the days of the weekend, 66 people were killed, 265 people were injured. On that day, 2 children died of malnutrition. On Friday, 57 Palestinians were killed. 16 were killed directly by airstrikes, according to officials at the Al-Aqsa Martyr Hospital. I want to share with you, I shared this in one of my daily updates. This is a quote I have permission to share from Laura Friedman. She's an an American Jewish human rights advocate, lawyer. She leads Foundation for Middle East Peace. And I thought her comments in this regard were so profound. So I want you to hear what she had to say. We had lunch together on Friday. She said, "It's morally obscene for us to be talking about post-war plans after Gaza. If we have the political will to come to an agreement about what should happen in terms of post-Gaza governance, how can we not have the political will to bring an end to the daily bombing, the starvation, and all of the atrocities? We have to spend all of our energy each and every day bringing a complete end to it. Otherwise, we're supporting, enabling, and telling those who are perpetuating the violence, just go ahead and finish the job." Now, what's she talking about in terms of finishing the job? This is very, very specific. The goal is, for many in Netanyahu's government, the goal is the complete and entire displacement of the Palestinian people, or anyone remaining be killed. And so when she talks about finishing the job, she's talking about specifically genocide. And I think it's really, really important that we directly address that. Lest we think that that's hyperbolic, ballyhoo, listen to what Channel 12 News reported in Israel this week. They said, if Hamas refuses to this plan, anyone who stays in Gaza will die. This was translated from Hebrew. It is not my translation. They said new details of the IDF's plan in case Hamas says no. Israel would give an ultimatum to the remaining 200,000 residents in Gaza City. The IDF would give them a brief time to leave the city. Anyone who stays in that city after that time period would be considered a terrorist. From that moment on, again, all electricity, water, and food would be cut off. Anyone still in the city will die. The chief of staff decided ahead of critical days in the Gaza Strip that all of the firepower of the IDF should be moved to the Southern Command. I think that's really important for us to understand. I shared this plea also last week, even though, the spirit right now globally is a spirit of celebration. I wanted us to hear the words of Tamer Nahed, who said this. He was writing from Gaza. He said, "Our children have lost everything. It's been more than 3 years without access to education. A generation is being erased before our very eyes. Infants and young children desperately need milk, healthy food, diapers, vaccinations, and even the most basic needs are out of reach. There's no electricity. There's no clean water. There's no proper care. The sick are suffering in silence. Many urgently need to leave Gaza to receive treatment, but all of the borders are closed and no one is listening. Countless lives have been lost just waiting for help that has never come. Life in Gaza is no longer livable. We're not asking for luxuries. We're asking for survival. This place is collapsing day by day. In truth, it has already collapsed. The world is watching. Please have mercy on the children. Have mercy on the elderly, on the women, on the sick. End this war before there is nothing left to save." I went through already some of the death tolls. In one, I think it was on Monday, the death toll was one of the lowest I've seen in recent weeks. It was 10 people. And yet the total number of those killed is still more than 67,160 people. On Saturday, 36 people were killed. We could go through all of those details. Other news from Israel. It broke this week that the state of Israel is intentionally targeting evangelical churches to gain support for its war efforts. Israel wants to hire leading, people in the public square like Chris Pratt, the actor, and Steph Curry, the NBA player. There was a new firm that was created in the U.S. called Show Faith by Works, and it's carrying out a campaign that's a $3.2 million outreach campaign that is digital, targeting U.S. churches and Western U.S. leaders on behalf of the Israeli government. The firm's goal, it had to file under the Foreign Agents Registration Act, is to create positive associations with the nation of Israel while linking the Palestinian population with extremist factors. On Sunday, there were sirens that were activated in the southernmost city in Israel in Eilat. They were likely intercepted. A woman in Jerusalem was lightly wounded by a car in an area checkpoint in what was a suspected attack. And meanwhile, settler attacks have continued throughout the occupied West Bank. One specific example, about 30 settlers on Saturday raided the homes of Bedouin Palestinians in the north of the West Bank. The settlers were masked and armed with clubs. They beat residents in the community. This was east of a village called Jabba. They hurled stones at them. The IDF force that arrived at the scene separated the sides by spraying tear gas and prevented the continuation of the raid. There's been news related to Qatar. Qatar, of course, has been front and center of these negotiations, but they also issued an executive order earlier this week. Trump issued an executive order earlier this week to say that Qatar's security and territorial integrity would be protected if the country were to come under attack. Of course, this was in response to Israel's attack of Qatar when it was targeting Hamas leaders that were part of the negotiating team there. In other words, the order states that an attack on Qatar would be treated as a threat to the peace and the security of the United States. Israeli news reported that the White House, this is quite interesting, it's being said that the White House drafted the apology that was issued to Qatar by Prime Minister Netanyahu, but he denied the claim. The creation of the new U.S. plan for the Gaza ceasefire was prompted by Israel's failed attempt to assassinate Hamas leaders in Qatar. So said some of the leaders who are engaged with Witkoff and Kushner. This led to the decision that widespread condemnation of Israel globally is an opportunity to end the war. The U.S. is seeking to take advantage of that dynamic. In Iran executed 6 death row inmates on Saturday. They were alleged to be involved in carrying out attacks on behalf of Israel. Syria had its first parliamentary elections this week since the fall of the Assad regime. Those results, initial results, were put forward in the first National Assembly elected. It's a 210-seat parliament. A third of the seats are being reserved for President Ahmed al-Shara. He's yet to appoint his nominees. One of the things that was reported is that there were an incredibly low number of women and minorities who were elected. Also, the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces allegedly killed a person and injured 4 others in attacks on checkpoints of the security forces of Syria in Aleppo. That happened on Monday night. Iranian-backed Houthi rebels in Yemen detained 9 UN personnel. That means the total of those arbitrarily detained UN staff in the Houthi-controlled areas has risen to 53. That's since 2021, but we don't know the timing or the conditions of those detentions. And just a couple updates related to Lebanon. The Trump administration approved and released $230 million in funding for Lebanese security forces. And there was an Israeli drone strike that killed a person and injured 5 others in the south of Lebanon a week ago today. Updates on the flotilla. There were a few different segments of the Samud flotilla. The Swedish activist Greta Thunberg yesterday alleged that she and other detainees were subjected to torture when they were held in Israeli prison. That happened last week. She said they were kidnapped and tortured. She did not go into details. Another 145 activists were detained who aimed to break the naval blockade of Gaza. By Monday, Israel had deported an additional 29 activists, and the previous Saturday, over the weekend, 137 activists were deported to Turkey. CMEP put out a statement condemning the attacks against the Samud flotilla. Overall, it included about 50 ships, 500 people, and there were 44 countries represented. Over the weekend, there were arrests that continued in London. This was in response to protests against the ban on Palestine action. I wanted to be sure to mention on October 2nd, 2 men were killed at a Hebrew Jewish congregation in Manchester in the UK. This was a car ramming and stabbing attack. And Jewish members of the community in Manchester said that they felt let down by British police and leadership for failing to reject anti-Jewish speech and protecting Jews from hate crimes. The man who attacked that synagogue in the north of England said he was acting on behalf of the Islamic State. Pro-Palestinian protesters were also arrested in Boston in the last couple of days. There was a violent clash with police there. And things are heating up around the world. There was a mass rally in Rome. 4 days in a row in Rome. This, I think, was over the weekend. They said that the organizers were hoping to attract at least 1 million people. Barcelona, during its weekend protests, had 70,000 people turn out for demonstrations protesting Israel's war in Gaza. Meanwhile, the U.S. has provided Israel with at least $21.7 billion in military assistance since the war began 2 years ago. And a U.S. federal judge this week dismissed a lawsuit that was accusing the UN Aid Agency for Palestinians, this is UNRWA, of allegedly allowing its funds to be diverted to support the Hamas attacks. And so that case was dismissed by a federal judge here in the U.S. this week. I'm closing just with some Christian news. The patriarchs and heads of Jerusalem renewed their condemnation of the unjust foreclosure against the Armenian Patriarchate. They put out a statement on September 26th about that. Gaza's parish priest of the Holy Family Catholic Church, Gabriele Romanelli, appealed in a video this week saying, "For mercy's sake, stop this war and stop killing people." And Cardinal Pizzaballa, the Patriarch of Jerusalem, Catholic, said, "We have never lived through a hardship such as this." He also had a video message that was delivered this past week. I call your attention, CMEP did put out this statement highlighting some of the things we've done in the last 2 years to respond to the ethnic cleansing and atrocities. And if you've not read that, I would encourage you to do that. It closed by saying, as we reflect on the second anniversary, we do so with grief and resolve. We remain committed to action. Our commitment in faith in Jesus, the Prince of Peace, has not wavered. Mourning with those who continue to suffer, we recommit ourselves to sustained action. We shall not cease until justice, peace, and human dignity prevail across the Holy Land. So that is our hope and prayer. May God continue to go before us. In the name of Christ. Amen.